Okie dokie. So it looks like our participant numbers have stabilised, so I think we might get started. Just to check, can everybody see those slides okay? Is that displaying all right? Yep, perfect, excellent. All righty. All right, so I'd like to start the session today by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands on which I work, and I think me and my Melbourne colleagues work, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and to pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. And also to recognise that the lands were and still are unceded. Okay, so my name is Crystal Spreadborough and I'm a research data specialist with the Melbourne Data Analytics Platform at the University of Melbourne. My background is in humanities and social sciences, and in my current role I apply these domain experiences to the data-intensive research landscape. So yes, I'm coming to you from Australia. All of the co-chairs today are coming to you from Australia. And thanks to those people who are joining us from unsociable time zones. Thank you for coming along today. I'm going to first introduce Keith Russell, who's going to lead us through a Mentimeter activity. So Keith is the Engagements Manager at the Australian Research Data Commons. And he engages with research organisations and research infrastructure organisations around Australia. In his role, he's worked on establishing projects and engagements in a wide range of organisations, including working on policies in the human and technical infrastructure required to make research data and tools more findable, accessible, interoperable and reusable, and to prepare the researchers and their organisations to benefit from for the data-intensive future. So I'm now going to hand over to Keith. I'll just progress to the next slide. All yours, Keith.
Thanks, Crystal. We thought we'd just kick in quickly 2 questions to get the sharing going and to give you a chance to throw in some of your ideas and your expectations for the session and what you want to get out of it. So if you go to www.menti.com and if you enter the code 824857, you'll be asked a question, and please fill that in. So I will now share my screen because that, yes, sorry to have stolen your screen, Crystal. You will get it back later. And now you should be able to see the responses that are coming in for the first question. So the question is very simply, what are your drivers for attending this session? What are your expectations? What are you hoping to get out of this? So we have 7 people that have already responded to this, and obviously interested in the topic. I think that's great to hear. That makes sense if you come to this BoF. But I find it's also quite interesting to see that interest in data management services, data management support in this area, people actually working in this space and trying to learn more to be able to best support researchers in that space. Managing large databases for research in mental health. Understanding the wide landscape of sensitive data management. Yes, wide landscape, I think is an interesting term there. DURC data. Reticent authors to share potentially sensitive data safely. Okay. Okay, I'll give it another minute or 2 and then we can move on to the next question. Software for privacy preserving analysis. Interesting. I think what we're seeing here is the breadth, and I think that's an interesting one. That's something that will come up further in the session too. Okay, I'd like to move on to the next question. Here we go. And the next question is, considering that whole breadth of sensitive data, what do you see as the most important element? Try and keep it short, and then we'll see, hopefully, the different responses come in and we might see some patterns emerging, or we might just see a huge breadth of different elements in sensitive data that are important. Interesting, the usability of sensitive data is an interesting angle. I think that's one of the questions that may well come up as we're talking about optimizing sensitive data. I think that's an interesting question, and the potential potential tensions with openness and confidentiality, maintaining confidentiality, enabling controlled access. What's central to all of this appears to be security. Okay, to not do harm, yes. That's a good one to keep in mind as we go into this session. Thank you. I think this is a great starting point to get a bit of a view of from the different perspectives in the room and different people attending. I'd like to now hand back to Crystal, or is it Priyanka, to take the next steps in this session. So thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Keith. I'm just going to share my screen again. Okay, so we'll kick off before we get into the lightning talks. We'll kick off with just a bit of an overview about the goals for the session today and what sort of brought us all together. Okay, so we all know that data is changing the way we think, work, research, and interact. And sensitive data is one aspect of this wider data ecosystem that has the potential for a high impact, especially in the context of research. But sensitive data also brings with it many challenges. So how do we share and link sensitive data in an ethical, legal, and moral way? How do we identify and mitigate risk? And what are the trade-offs we're willing to accept between the potential gains and the potential losses when we're working with the data of some of our most vulnerable people, places, and things? In this BoF today, we're going to discuss these questions and more. And there are two concepts here that are going to be central to our discussion today. The first is, what is sensitive data? So in this BoF, we're exploring the idea that the sensitiveness of data is not a fixed concept. Sensitivity depends on the context and the data situation. Sensitivity is also relevant to non-human data, such as data about places, things, and animals. At its heart, though, we're working with the idea that sensitive data is sensitive when its context, and its data situation have the potential for harm to people, places, animals, or things. The second concept that we'll be talking about is what is optimization. So by optimization, we mean the consideration of how data assets can be used to their fullest potential. So of course, this relates to how these data are managed, how they're used, linked, shared, stored, and reused. But it also relates to the ethics and governance that underpin how we interact with data. It relates to the software, the tools, and the technology we use to explore the data. And it relates to our fundamental understanding of what data is, what research is, and what knowledge is constructed from the interaction of these two things. So in the lightning talks and in the subsequent discussion, you'll see different configurations of how optimization and how sensitive data are conceptualized. And that's really the aim of this BoF, to contribute to a shared understanding of what optimizing sensitive data means in different disciplinary contexts. I'm now going to introduce Priyanka Pillai, who will be chairing the lightning talks and who's going to give our first lightning talk today. So Priyanka has a background in bioinformatics and software programming and works as an academic specialist at the University of Melbourne. Priyanka works as a research data specialist for the Melbourne Data Analytics Platform and as a health and informatics specialist for the Australian Partnership for Preparedness Research on Infectious Disease Emergencies Centre of Excellence, which is based at the Peter Doherty Institute for Infection and Immunity, located here in Melbourne, Australia. Okay, so Priyanka, I'm going to hand over to you. Would you like to just let me know when you want to go to the next slide?
Thanks, Crystal. I'll do that, yeah. And thank you for the introduction and setting the scene for sensitive data. It is a wide landscape. Yes, that was my word. And I'm keen to explore that with lightning talks and the workshop and discussion sessions going forward. Next slide, please, Crystal. So I'll be talking about health data, and that's where most of my work has been. So I've worked a bit in cancer genomics research, which sits on a very different point on the sensitivity spectrum. And then I started working in public health, which again becomes a whole different landscape. So I'll be exploring health data sensitivity, the sensitivities in health data first as a broad concept, and then diving a bit into infectious diseases, because that's where most of my work has been, and it is a hot topic right now. So next slide, please. Crystal? So health data, so all forms of health data, whether it's the personal medical records, information that's collected in hospitals, research, laboratory settings, and any form of health and biomedical data is needed to curate the evidence-based for decision-making. So whether it's a public health level decision-making, whether it's patient level decision-making, whether it's population level decision-making, or even precision medicine that goes down right to the genomics level of a person, we do need a rich evidence base for that decision-making, and health data contributes to that. But sadly, health data contains personally identifiable information, and this is completely unique to you. I once heard in a cybersecurity talk that you can change your bank details, you can change your address, you can change all other aspects of your life, but you cannot change your genetic code, you cannot change your health information or the unique health data that's just yours. You can't change that. So that's why it makes it a lot more sensitive. And the most commonly defined health data indicators, so death rate, life expectancy, infant mortality, maternal mortality, child health, physician's density, and all forms of indicators and well-being indicators as well, not just health, are often linked to social and economic determinants. So where you live, what your education level is, how much you earn, and what level of education that I've covered, and also race. It has been quite a determinant in the ongoing pandemic as well, and how response affects people differently. And health data cybersecurity has been a global concern. There's been instances where even our systems here in Australia was hacked. And then there's ransomware attacks, because we all know that health data is extremely sensitive. We'll do anything to protect it, and it can be misused in so many different ways. Next slide, please, Crystal. I don't know if you can see it, not maybe all of it, but this is the WHO conceptual health data ecosystem. And the point that this health data ecosystem is trying to make is that there's a vast amount of information data that's held in different domains and spheres. So not just focusing on health, but how it all contributes to health, because the policy, healthcare industry, research, individual level data, public health, environment, lifestyle and socioeconomic information, behavioral information, technological capabilities, they're all connected. They all form one ecosystem, and they hold tremendous potential for research, policy making, and enhancing basically the health outcomes for people. Next slide, please, Crystal. And infectious diseases data, like I said, it's a whole different level of sensitivity, because as we've all seen now, how much it contributes to policy, how political it can get, and because it then directly correlates with border control measures, it relates to employment, it relates to the types of employments and some of the systemic issues that can be highlighted in the system. So casual workforce, how the schools are practicing distancing measures. There's lots and lots of political aspects there. So it's not just a health problem. And COVID-19 has highlighted the importance of data-led and data-driven response. We've all heard that the data is driving the decisions, whether it's one case number, whether it's one negative test, whether it's one positive test, how many tests we've done. They're all important factors to consider for the next step that we take towards freedom or locking us down, basically. And infectious disease and communicable diseases have always been around. Pandemics have always been around. But how well do we know that the data is being optimized before it's used for decision making? So the sensitivities around health data, around identifiability, privacy, protecting someone's sensitive information, that becomes even more critical during a pandemic. And that's why we need to be very careful how we're optimizing it, how we're transforming it as well, before that data is used for decision making. So a small data point coming from an area with very little population, with fewer people in there, that data point about a person with specific health indicators or socioeconomic indicators can potentially identify that person. And if you look at an area that's quite densely populated, the same type of data, the same level of anonymization may not be, may not identify that person, but it all comes down to the context, right? It all comes down to different factors. It's not just removing personally identifiable information and that's it, you're done. And that's why I feel sensitivity, not just in health domain, it sits on a spectrum. It depends on the research study design, it depends on the context, it depends on what you're trying to do with the data, it depends on what level you want to de-identify, anonymize, or make it less sensitive and use it for research purposes or policymaking purposes. So that's why it's important to include stakeholders. When I say stakeholders, I'm talking about everybody, researchers, people who contribute their data, clinicians who work in this space, everybody who's involved in the dialogue. We all need to understand how we improve the management, optimize sensitive information, both during routine research as well as during an emergency, because we want to be prepared for the next outbreak and not worry about the sensitivities associated with data, but making sure that we're doing the right thing, using the data appropriately and making the right decisions. And that's it from me. Next slide, please, Crystal. Sorry, I just needed to highlight one more thing. Sorry, I missed that. I needed to talk to the ecosystem. And like I said, it's a broad ecosystem. Health data itself is broad, but in infectious diseases, there's lots and lots of factors. There's clinical data, medical data, lab data, administrative data sets like vaccine records and other things that's held in the administrative silos, community participation, we as community members, as stakeholders who contribute data, epi data, surveillance data, and the sensitive socioeconomic factors and determinants that are collected on vulnerable populations and people who are at risk. So they all form a part of the ecosystem and have different levels of sensitivity. So even within the domain, within the subdomain, there's different levels of sensitivities depending on what data type you're looking at. Next slide, please, Crystal. That's it from me. I will introduce Alex Mihalowicz now, who works as an academic specialist at the University of Melbourne Data Analytics Platform, just like me and Crystal. Alex has an MA in Classics and a PhD in Archaeology and is an honorary research fellow at the University School of Historical and Philosophical Studies. The focus of her present role in MDAP is collaboration with researchers across the university on data-intensive research, both in terms of stewardship and analytics.
Thank you, Priyanka, and hello, everyone. So today I invite you to join me on a series of questions about ways in which we conceive of, collect, interpret, and value sensitive data collections. So this talk is pitched as having a focus on the humanities, which here encompass also the arts and social sciences, but in fact, the points we will cover are applicable to all disciplines. Thus, what we will investigate together are the types of questions humanities scholars might ask when considering the topic. Thanks, Crystal. Next slide, please. All right, I'm not sure if you can see it, but the PhD comic here is about whether the word data is singular or plural. And although we are not addressing this specific point, this type of interrogation goes to the heart of the content of this talk. So we're going to consider what is meant by optimization, sensitive, and data, though we're going to set research aside for today. We can't cover everything in this session. So optimization, clearly this has a multifaceted meaning, and in the present context, it's about maximizing the utility of the data in question. But what might be the reverse of optimized data, and can data be de-optimized? In terms of sensitivity, can we argue that all data is sensitive? What would non-sensitive data look like? So for example, does publicly available data mean that it is not sensitive? I would argue no. And further, what is understood as sensitive by one researcher or community may not be seen as such by others. And in terms of data, what even is data? Is this a fact, an idea, a measurement, a recording? Is there a line between data and research data? This session is predicated on the understanding that we are discussing digital sensitive data and probably large amounts of it. But of course, that may not be the case, especially for humanities scholars. And we need also to acknowledge that small data or singular data is also invaluable. So for example, a novel or a piece of music. Next slide, please, Crystal. So to ethics. Again, what is this in the context of sensitive data? Really, we need an ethics of ethics. So here, this includes, but does not refer only to the processes imposed on researchers by their institutions. What duties of care do we have towards the data which we have or intend to collect? And who really are we serving in our research of sensitive data and in our optimization of this? Are we serving ourselves as scholars, our disciplines, the broader academy, the data itself, our subject matter and its origins? Maybe all of these things. So it seems also that we require a philosophy for data-driven research, and especially so for sensitive data. So we're going to return to our three key terms: optimization. How do we understand this in terms of, for example, primary and secondary use? Is reuse always optimal? Beyond origin, do we need to consider a chain of custody for sensitive data? In terms of sensitivity, is this synonymous with valuable? Is sensitive data intrinsically more valuable than non-sensitive data? And touching in passing upon privacy, de-identification, and anonymity, just because something can be studied, does that mean it should? So I'm not going to discuss care and fair in detail, but even the order in which we often refer to these principles demonstrates a specific hierarchy, not just of concept, but of practice. And flipping these around, as you can see on the slide, actually tells a different story. So, and coming back to data, what do we digitize? What exists only in digitized format? How far do our ethical responsibilities extend? What should remain analog or in physical form only? What cannot be digitized? Thank you, Crystal. So, humanities scholars are often perceived to be conservative in their research practices, but actually many humanities researchers have already been working with sensitive digital data for decades, optimized or otherwise, and many are proficient in digital research methods more commonly ascribed to our colleagues in the broadly defined scientific and medical fields. But even the concept of humanities data is restrictive and inaccurate. In fact, data itself continues to expand not just in volume, but in application, increasingly bleeding across domains and less bound by disciplinary parameters, and expanding as do our technologies. So this transforms what we conceive data to be, how it can function, and to what end. And all of this is important to discussing, it's fundamental to discussing sensitive data and its optimization. So, although there is some way to go in terms of optimizing sensitive data for research in humanities, there is some way to go. And though there may be some established or entrenched attitudes and approaches, this is changing and rapidly. And we should not underestimate the impact and power that sensitive data research can wield in the humanities domain, especially when optimized. Next slide, thanks, Crystal. So just some examples of ways in which digital and sensitive data are evolving include concepts such as open data, linked data, data lakes and data warehouses, ontologies and semantics in all senses, epistemologies, hermeneutics, and so on and so forth. This is an extremely fast-moving landscape, and we have an opportunity here to contribute to how contemporary and future research practices around sensitive data are engaged with and deployed by the academy. This is especially the case for those academics whose research crosses disciplinary and, better yet, domain boundaries. So other questions we might ask include, to what extent should data be fair? Does optimizing sensitive data for research mean that, in fact, sometimes we don't make it available at all? In working with sensitive data, what compromises are required of us as scholars? And does the fact that so much data now is ephemeral or intangible affect our research? And last slide, thanks, Crystal. Thank you. So as we know, it's far easier to ask questions than to answer them, but this BoF is a good place to do so. And some of these questions must be addressed as we move forward in our pursuit of maximizing the potential of sensitive data for research. So some very quick proposed recommendations include, beyond method and application, we should continue an interdisciplinary conversation about the theory pertaining to the handling and use of sensitive data, especially when optimized. The full benefits of this can only be achieved through active collaboration between professional data experts and academic domain specialists in all disciplines. There needs to be a stronger understanding also of the fair and care principles. This is important everywhere. And for those of us based in Australia, this should really be acknowledged as crucial to a holistic understanding of our research environment and conduct. Talking about these principles prompts crucial conversations for scholars. And finally, in producing guidelines, we must define spectra of data sensitivity. Multiple simultaneous levels might be applicable to a data set or collection. Moreover, different research methods and uses might trigger different types of sensitivity badging. So especially as we move forward with increased volumes of digital and cross-domain data, it's important that researchers have access to protocols for collecting, analysing, storing, sharing and reusing data, especially sensitive data. This will help both protect and optimise sensitive data research, and it will likewise ensure that researchers can practice their craft with confidence in method and ethical conduct in their handling of this optimised sensitive data. So to finish up, there's much to be gained by our focusing together specifically on sensitive research data, its optimisation, and especially when considering this across disciplines. Thank you all for listening, and I look forward to discussing this further throughout the session.
Thanks, Alex. So now that we've covered 2 domains and sensitive data in 2 domains, are there any questions? There's one question in the chat and I can quickly address that, but if there are any other questions, please feel free to use the raise hand function or post it in the chat window. So my definition of optimization could be different from other people's optimization. So for me, optimization is any kind of processing, pre-processing, cleaning, or transformation that you apply on the data to make it usable for your analytics purposes or for any other not processing, but yeah, analytics purposes, whether you're running modeling or whether you're doing some sort of statistical analysis or any form of drawing knowledge out of it. That's my understanding of optimization. Could be removing duplication, could be, and in this context for sensitive data, making it as anonymized as possible, addressing things such as differential privacy, because anonymization alone doesn't address the privacy concerns. So making it optimal for research purposes. That's how I would define it. Does anyone else want to contribute?
I guess I might add to that question, to that answer, and I suppose as I'll address in a second in my talk, that I agree that we should have a shared understanding of what optimization means, and we should have a shared understanding that it's about the technical aspects of the data, as Priyanka just very nicely articulated, and it's also about those other things that underpin how we interact with that data. You know, what we accept as ethical and moral, and the way that we expect research to be conducted would be other facets, I think, that are important.
I think Steve made a really good point in the chat window that one way to think about optimal is the trade-off between utility and privacy, and that's something that kept coming up in the COVID-19 context as well. So there's protecting privacy, there's protecting sensitivity of the information, but at the same time the utility, right? We need fast response, we need to get the data out there. Yeah, absolutely. And the methodologies would be different. Optimization applied to the data itself, and the algorithms or the processes that lead to optimization would be different. So thank you for that, Matthew. And thanks for your comments, Steve. So if there are no further comments, we can move on and look at a broader lens of, look at sensitive data through a broader lens. And I will hand over to Crystal, who will talk about the institutional sensitive data practices. Over to you, Crystal.
Excellent. Thank you, Priyanka. Okay, so before we get into institutional sensitive data practices, I thought it might be good to begin by addressing, why should institutions invest in practices for optimizing sensitive data for research? And there are already plenty of examples of the potential of optimized data to yield new and novel insights. I mean, take the private sector, for example. This sector has quickly realised the benefits of optimising personal data. And in the private sector, our data is bought and sold like any other commodity. But also like any other commodity, it's a refined product that has the most value. So private companies put large amount of resources into refining our data, and not just into a single output, but to enhance the ability for our data to be shaped and moulded in different ways, depending on the context. Because it's not just my Facebook data, for example, that is of value, but it's the ability to plug this data into another data set, which is where the real power of this data lies. And while there may be many questions of the morality and ethics of this practice, it is effective for the specific purpose for which it's done. So why should institutions invest in optimising sensitive data? Well, because it's a lucrative business, and not for the accumulation of wealth, but for the construction of knowledge. So if we put time and energy into optimising the way we work with sensitive data, and if we do this in a coordinated way, it becomes possible to create networks of data sets that were previously independent. And this is not necessarily new. We've already seen the potential for this kind of linked data in health data sets, which is especially demonstrated during the time of the pandemic, and which Priyanka spoke about and is an expert on as well. So now we need to ask what needs to be done to extend this kind of method to other disciplines. So what does it mean to optimise sensitive data from an institutional perspective? So I'd suggest there are 4 elements that are important. First, it's about the characteristics of the data, and we were just talking about this a little bit in the question and answer before. So this involves all the attributes of making the data fair, as well as aspects of context and provenance, and the potential to create linked sensitive data sets. Second, it's about the infrastructure in which the data is housed. So this involves security, storage, analysis, as well as how humans interface with that data through virtual environments. Third, it's about the principles and practices of how we interact with that data. It's questions of ethics, of governance, and of consent. And fourth, it's about the research values. That is what we value in research in the first place, our attitudes towards things like open scholarship, our expectations of researchers and their expectations of the institution, as well as the epistemology of the research field. You know, what is considered a valid way to construct knowledge? And these elements do not exist in equilibrium, but they're mediated by the demands and the tensions that are inherent in the institutions in which research is undertaken. So let's have a look at the institutional context in a little bit more detail. Okay, so let's speak to this figure a little bit. So data, the sensitive data is at the centre. Characteristics of the data can be more or less controlled by the institution, in the sense that sometimes we receive sensitive data from other places and sometimes we create it ourselves, and sometimes it's a combination of both. Infrastructure is important in the institutional context. Infrastructure can be expensive and it carries a large amount of responsibility, and it's also resource intensive to support. But it is essential because without good institutional support for infrastructure, we cannot interact with many forms of data. And infrastructure and research values are interestingly interlinked. First, there's the researcher's expectation of how certain infrastructure will behave. So one example of this in my experience is with secure virtual environments, which are environments that are locked down, no external access, no internet access. Now, the front end of these machines often look like your regular PC. So sometimes when a researcher enters the environment, there's an expectation that it will behave in a similar way to their PC. But this is not the case. And managing expectations around this is important for optimising the use of data in the research context. And there are also sets of values in different disciplines around open scholarship, what can be shared, what should be withheld for safety. And of course, there's the epistemology of different disciplines. So often university policies and strategies require a level of standardisation that may not always be able to capture the diversity of value sets inherent in different disciplinary contexts. And then we have principles and practices, and these also tend to operate in conjunction with research values. So as with all data, there's the question of governance, and governance can operate at several levels depending on the custodianship and ownership. From this, there are also protocols for how data are interacted with within the infrastructure in which it's housed. And there's also the high-level principles of ethics and consent that often require an institutional level of oversight, such as through ethics committees. And this itself can be a difficult balancing act as well. So in this way, optimisation is not a static concept, but a fluid one. It's responsive to the tensions and the pressures within the institution. But while there is significant buy-in required, there's also significant payoff. So at this point, Priyanka, would you like me to hand to Nichola or address the question?
Maybe addressing the question would be good because it's a good one. So yeah.
Right, so that means that means that principles drive other components. Yes, if I've understood the question correctly, I think that is definitely true. Consent is interesting, and that's been touched on earlier in this BoF in terms of is reuse optimal, and what is consent and what is informed consent. You know, if you think about it in terms of health data, for example, who is consenting to universities using that data? Is it the individual patients? Is it the GPs who provide the data to the university? Who has the ability to consent there? So I think that consent is a really interesting one. Ethics is like filters through to everything, I think, you know, because it's ethics that governs what we think is the right or the wrong thing to do with data. And I think, you know, different research fields will have different ethical considerations as well. And it's interesting to look at that tension between discipline-specific ethics and, you know, a level of standardized institutional level ethics that that may also have to exist. And how to do without consent. I don't have an answer for that, but it's a great question. I don't know if the answer is to do away with anything, but maybe to recast it, to think through the options. And I suppose to recognise that sometimes the systems we have in place are imperfect, and that's okay. And how do we work with those systems?
I think because consent, I'm quite passionate about that topic, so I'll quickly add my 2 cents. I think with consent, privacy, and everything else, it's all about balance, right? So there's a concept of dynamic consent where you involve the people contributing their data or consenting to their data at every stage, whenever any kind of use or reuse is happening for their data. But that comes with a huge overhead as well. So you'll need to maintain those processes, infrastructure, and platforms in place that will regularly engage with the participants to get their dynamic consent. And whether it's feasible or not, it depends on obviously the research budget, the study, what level of sensitivities there are. So yes, the principles, the level of sensitivity, and what the intended outcomes are for optimizing that data drives what we do with the data, what happens to the data, and also drives the ethics of it, drives the consent, drives the legal requirements as well. If I were to tie everything together, and if that answered your question. Promain. So if there are no other questions for Crystal, I will move on to the next speaker. Our next speaker is Nichola. So Nichola Burton works at the Australian, sorry, Crystal, next slide, please. I forgot about that. Sorry, so yes, Nichola Burton works at the Australian Research Data Commons as an engagements consultant for the WA institutions. Nichola has a PhD in psychology with a research background in face perception. In her present role, she co-facilitates the Australian Sensitive Data Community of Practice. And Nichola will talk about building an Australian sensitive data community of practice and what we can learn from her in an international context. Thank you, Nichola.
Thank you. So at the ARDC, we're very interested in creating common approaches and cohesion across the sector. And something that we'd noticed as we dealt with our partners is that we were getting a lot of questions around how to manage and share sensitive data appropriately. So if you go to the next slide. Oh, backward, yeah. We were very happy to participate in a Birds of a Feather session at eResearch Australasia 2018 called Sensitive Data, How Do You Do Yours?, where we brought together a whole range of different people who were working in sensitive data to talk about the problems that they were facing and their approaches. And something that came out of this Birds of a Feather session was a real enthusiasm for maintaining that conversation, for continuing to share between all of the different disciplines who are working with sensitive data. So next slide. So out of that Birds of a Feather session came our Sensitive Data Community of Practice, which the AIDC co-facilitates with 2 other Australian organisations, the Australian Data Archive and ARNet. And you can, if you want to find out more about the community of practice beyond what I'll tell you today, we do have a website as well as a mailing list where you can find out about past meetings and see notes and that kind of thing. Sorry, next slide. So this community of practice has quite a broad audience because, as I'm sure you're aware, there are many different disciplines and roles who deal with sensitive data. So we aim to reach researchers, government and the medical community who work with sensitive data. And that means that we get a combination of researchers, we also get research support staff, and then people in other data related roles such as policymakers. And we have participants from a diverse set of research domains, including health and medical, social sciences, people working with geospatial data, people working in ecology. And so because that's such a broad group, at the start of the community of practice, there were a number of sessions where we basically just tried to work out what it was that people wanted to get out of this community, because needs could be quite varied. But a couple of things that came out were that people really were looking for information sharing. They were very aware that people were working with sensitive data in other disciplines and other institutions who might have quite different approaches or solutions to problems that they were facing. So really there was quite a focus on how are you managing to share your sensitive data? And then there was also a need for some guidance. So people looking for particular guidelines, looking for decision models, that kind of thing. Sorry, next slide. So our current format for the community has monthly meetings with rotating topics. So each month we'll cover a topic from either the governance sphere. So for instance, we have presentations from Australia's Office of the National Data Commissioner, who are working on the legislation for the sharing of federal government data, or a technology topic. So for instance, looking at platforms for the sensitive, secure analysis of sensitive data or secure storage options. And then we'll also hear from specific research disciplines, getting ideas of best practice within those areas. And then we also have 1 or 2 sort of in-practice meetings per year, which are longer sessions where an expert will talk to us about a specific practical area. So for instance, this year we heard about the various methods for de-identification. Next slide. So a couple of the challenges that I see in this group that I think we should consider when we think about an international community of practice is that this is an incredibly broad topic with a very diverse group of people. And so something to think about is how to maintain a core community and a sense of a particular network of people who are working together, as opposed to people from a very broad group sort of drifting in and out of a set of meetings. And I think that that's yeah, sort of an open question as to how to manage that, although there is a lot to be gained from sharing between diverse domains and institutions. And then something else that we're thinking about now in our community is that I think we're doing really well in terms of information sharing between disciplines, but something we want to think about more is how to bring the community together to produce things. So, you know, if the group is looking for guidance and say decision models, well, you know, no individual facilitator of the community can provide that. It's something we have to do together. So we're thinking about models for producing some of those outputs. And that's something I think, again, that we need to think about in this international community. Cool, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Nichola. Are there any questions for Nichola before we break out into little breakout rooms and start workshopping some ideas? There's one question from Romain around forming an international sensitive data community of practice and joint efforts. And I think we all agree that that was one of the goals of this workshop, is to gauge the interest and find out what the existing communities of practices are and align ourselves with what's happening instead of reinventing the wheel. Stephanie's comments quite interesting as well. That's good. Yeah. It has been quiet. Yeah, I agree. If there are no specific questions for Nichola, what we will
sorry, Priyanka, it's not really a question, but I think it's just an observation. I think on the one hand, there is value in having international exchange around this. And I think sometimes there's also value in having national exchange around this, because there's national legislation and sometimes it's worth having conversations within a specific context around what does sensitive data mean, because you are in a specific country with specific rules around how to treat data. So I think that's where having the Australian one is useful, because that's very easy to couch within the Australian context in Australian legislation. But I think there's a lot of value in having that international exchange too, especially because in disciplines are of course not limited by national board boundaries.
That's a really good point, Keith. And I think that's where the definition of community of practice, right? How long is a piece of string, or how far do you want to cast the net? Community of practice then brings together people with similar ideologies, people who want to do similar work, but then adapting that to the local context is really important. Otherwise, nothing would be operationalized if we want to, be realistic about what we want to achieve. So that local operationalization is really important, but at the same time, there should be an overarching set of principles and concepts that people agree upon. Again, also agreeing to disagree. And no, not everything will be the same across different regions, across settings, across domains, but having some sort of underlying principles that we can all agree upon, and then adapting that to the local context, and then operationalizing the optimization or the management of sensitive data assets. Excellent. So the next workshop, so we will break out into two breakout rooms, and the aim is, Crystal, could you change the slide, please? Thank you. So our discussion is around sensitive data in your domain. So we want to know what your thoughts are. Have you ever worked in the sensitive data space? Is there anything specific that you want to talk about from your area of work? Even if it's not sensitive, would you place it on the spectrum of sensitivity? Would you place it anywhere on the spectrum? What challenges you've experienced in this context? What are your ideas about solution? What are your ideas, solutions, shareable resources that you've come across, strategies for optimizing sensitive data for research? We would love to hear from you. So we are short on time. So we have cut down the time from both the sessions. So the breakout session would run for about 15 minutes. And then we'll have the discussion session for about 15 minutes, and we'll leave some time in between for questions and discussions. So we will see everyone back in the main room in 15 minutes. And Nichola will now assign you to a breakout room. So see you in one of the breakout rooms, wherever I am.
You should now be seeing an invitation to enter a breakout room. If you're having any trouble, just give me a shout and I'll see if I can sort it out. Hi, Vera. I see that you're out here in the main room. Can I help you out with joining a breakout session?
Nichola, thank you for managing the breakout rooms. It's a bit of an experiment. Like, I have no idea how to do it. So I'm so glad that you know what you're doing. And thanks
No worries.
for keeping people together. And thank you so much.
No worries. So I think in the breakout room 2 will be joining us within the next 30 seconds. So I think they'll just be wrapping up their conversation. Ah, here they come. Okay, and everyone's back together.
Just give people a few more seconds before we move on to the next, because I think the numbers are a bit lower. Did people get lost?
I think that this is everyone who's still with us is now back in the main room.
Perfect. Thank you for that, Nichola. Excellent. This, I think, I'm sure the other breakout room also did well. We had very intense discussions. We covered a lot of ground. And I think now it's time to bring it all together. So moving on to the next item on our workshop, next agenda item on our workshop. We will discuss on the next steps forward, establishing a working group or a community of practice or different pathways where people can bring more ideas together, think about what outputs we can produce, guidelines, charter, or anything. And before we move on to the next aspect, I just wanted to mention that we've tried to cover a lot of ground here, whether it's domain specific or at an institutional level or at a national context or a local context. But I would still say that we haven't covered everything. There are some very important areas such as indigenous data sovereignty that we are not able to talk to because we are not the experts. But we aim to bring those experts into the room when we are able to establish a working group or an interest group, because there is an interest there, but it's just a matter of being able to bring people, really busy people, into the room while there's a lot going on as well. So we really wanted to bring some fantastic indigenous researchers who would have talked to sovereignty and how it's important for decision making and policy making, but unfortunately we were unable to, and it wouldn't be appropriate for us to talk to that. So we're really looking forward to bringing more voices, more diverse voices and important voices once we establish something. So I would hand over to Nichola and Keith to chair the next session on the discussion, and we'll MDACers, University of Melbourne peeps here, will pitch in wherever we can. Nichola and Keith, could you take it? Handing over to you.
Sure thing. Keith, you had an expectant look?
Well, first of all, I just want to say thanks, Priyanka, and thank you everybody for the discussions in those breakout rooms. It was really interesting to hear the wide variety of perspectives and all the input that was coming from the wall. I think it's really interesting to hear the interest that very interesting to hear the interests coming in from around the room. But I was sort of puzzling about this, and also as we were preparing this session, thinking about what would be a useful next step forward. Is there an interest, an appetite to continue this conversation? Is there specific work that we that you would be interested in focusing on based on this discussion? Now, first of all, I think I saw in the chat a few comments about existing groups that tackle some of this within Research Data Alliance. So I think Stephanie mentioned something and Stephen Kekan mentioned something. Would you like to speak about that, Steve, briefly?
Just to say, so I'm one of the co-chairs of the social science interest group as well. When we established the social science interest group, there was kind of three areas of interest. One was around national data policies. The second was on data quality. And the third was sensitive data, because it's relevant across so many domains in the social sciences. our intent was always to be looking at how we could collaborate with other interest groups to explore different elements, and that was one of the intents. Was where might there be common either interest groups or working groups where we could work on specific issues and ideas, and that was one of the core reasons we established it in that way. So it's just to put it on the table that we haven't we had it was the last it was RDA 15 in Melbourne. We were hoping to run that discussion, was actually a theme discussion in the social science interest group on sensitive data. Circumstances being what they were, that didn't happen. But it crosses over so many of the interests, as Alex kind of touched on, in the HAS domains generally, that I think I can speak effectively certainly for the co-chairs in there, that we would be and we were very keen to be involved in any sort of interest group or particularly working groups on specific issues, and happy to explore what those might be.
Thanks. Stephanie, you mentioned could you elaborate on other working groups, interest groups or existing in RDA on this?
Yeah, just one, the ethics and social aspects of data interest group. Sorry, I'll just turn my video on. It's a bit disconcerting. So they started a long time ago, and they've shifted to somewhat more of a health focus, I think. But it may be worth checking with them where they're at, and it's quite possible that they will not do much in this area at the moment. But it's certainly a group to maybe connect with and see where they're going, and whether there's whether they're still going to be active. So there might be some synergies, or whether they want to wind up. Then their group might be a good way of recruiting more participants if you're doing anything ongoing.
Okay, great, thanks. Well, that's useful for a bit of context. So listening to the discussions we've had so far, are there key things that have popped up that you say, well, that would be something that's worth working on? That's something that in the sensitive data realm, hearing these discussions, that's something we should continue work on. Is there anything that springs to mind? So please either put it in the chat or just speak out now.
I think a good place to start would be to make sure that there are diverse voices in the room that can talk to different aspects of sensitivities of data, and also different uses of the data, different context. So if we're aiming to form a working group or a community of practice, or any other pathway of engagement where people continue to talk to each other and get together to workshop ideas, I think the voices that are in the room are really important. Not saying that this room is not diverse enough, but I think the more diverse voices we have, I think the more justice we do to the space. That's how I feel. So that would be a good place to start. So diversity in terms of geography as well. So having people from both hemispheres running time in, sessions in different time zones, making sure that people can attend, their voices are included, people from different domains, people who can speak to different subdomains as well. And yeah, different aspects, and who have different backgrounds as well in research data management or delivery of service.
So something that came up in Breakout Room 1 was a discussion of the fact that sensitive data can mean quite different things depending on context, and also depending on geographical context. And I actually wonder whether that's something that it could be useful to kind of to sort of to formalize a little bit, to get a sense of just how, I think we have a sense that that's quite diverse, but it could be quite interesting to find out really how much diversity there is. Does anyone have any thoughts on differences they've observed?
That came up a bit, Nichola, in our breakout room. Kira, I think you mentioned the example of somebody who had sensitive data from a particular country, and which was why they would not be able to share that data. We talked a little bit around the other facets of optimizing that data. So not necessarily just sharing, making the data open, but practices, reproducible scholarship kinds of practices. And other aspects of that. Did anyone who was in the group want to comment on that?
Maybe just a note that, yeah, data can be sensitive for different reasons, and it might be like a health data, or sensitive for privacy reasons, but it might also be sensitive for cultural reasons, cultural norms. And since that can vary so widely, yeah, I guess it is a tricky topic, and maybe bears more conversation.
I think that's possibly an impossible task, Nichola, as well, which is, yeah. I mean, one of the questions might be to explore the, the notions of where sensitivity are likely to be coming from. So what might, the one that didn't come up that we have kind of avoided is commercially sensitive. As one example, which is, it has all sorts of other sensitivities, but the IP involved in that for institutions and for commercial enterprises brings its own challenges. So understanding where sort of sensitivities might lie and some of those dimensions or domains might be part of that. The other thing that I think came out of our group was sort of discussions on frameworks for thinking about, could you standardize some of these things? And I would say, the globalization, localization discussion was actually pretty interesting there, which is by understanding the dimensions of what might represent sensitivity, you have a starting of a framework for thinking about that. The other part of it might be, and this is the work that obviously that we're doing in collaboration with ARDC, is a framework for thinking about how you enable that, or access, think about the frameworks for what are the things you can actually step back from any specific domain? And there are some. And framing some of those up a little bit more. All the 5 states work that's happening here in Australia is not Australian origins. It's the UK and halfway across Europe. There's some big work that's already, big chunks of work that have already been done. And how might we leverage some of those, those sorts of thinkings, and think, similarly, the international data sovereignty, Indigenous data sovereignty work is a big international collaboration. So there are some ways we can abstract this. How do we think about those?
So looking at, I suppose the benefit of having a diverse group is to be able to step back and say, okay, but what are the things that we have in common that may be different? We may have different ideas about what data is sensitive, but we all have concerns around what access, for instance, mediation and access, or I don't know, does anyone want to throw anything into the chat about things that they see as being common concerns to many areas of sensitive data?
Consent was the occurring theme in our breakout room.
Was that one consent?
Yes. Sorry, I forgot how to drive technology for a minute there. Yes, consent was a reoccurring. And especially sort of sharing data. We talked a bit about how we're, Siglin's just put collaboration and sharing into the chat. We talked about how oftentimes we come into the conversation at the very end, by which point the practices for sharing sensitive data, it's almost too late in a way. And that relates to consent and the kind of consent obtained.
And I see, Priyanka, you've talked about personally identifiable information, but I think that there are issues to do with identifiability that move beyond personal data, right? So if you're talking about, ecologically sensitive data, for instance, there are that same issue of being able to combine multiple data sets to reveal information that people are trying to obscure becomes an issue when protecting sensitive species, for instance. Yeah, data use agreements and sharing across borders. Definitely. Yeah, collaboration and sharing. Romain, I see AI services recommendations from EOS can be a great model. Do you want to tell us anything more about that? No pressure though. Don't want to put anyone on the spot.
Oh, sorry, I was muted. So I've put the link in the chat. So its recommendations about how to provide, you know, protections and authentication services in a non-centralized data system, and I think that it could be a good source of ideas. So I think that you should have this reads. I know that that you know these links for all of for a big part of you, but the idea is to have an authentication and authorization infrastructure that permit to connect all fair data points to permit that all sensitive data are connected, shared between people that are authorized. So I think that this model could be really great at the large scale level, not only in Europe. So just
brilliant. Thank you so much for sharing.
Yes.
Mm.
Yeah, and one of the things that also came up in our group was struggling when you're right at the end to actually be able to share data, and making sure that there's training and resources for researchers which are discipline specific before that to guide researchers through that process and to guide them with consent and other software, infrastructure that might be useful to enable that. So it sounds like we've come up with a whole range of different perspectives and interests, and ideally we'd have a diverse group of people to work on that. You have all put, hopefully you've all put your names in the collaborative document, and there we have now a list of the people that attended this session, and you've the last question there was interested in participating further. So and I see that we have an overwhelming majority, so that's great to hear. So I think that's a great basis, great starting point to see if we can take this further. Priyanka, do you want to speak about maybe next steps with this group?
Sure, Keith. I think what my understanding of all the discussions and bringing some threads together is that it does look like a community of practice, right? And because community of practice is broad, it doesn't actually forces us to produce outputs within a specified time frame. We can actually take some time to define that framework in an international context and then adapt it locally to different settings, if that's how I'm reading the room here. So it might be useful, and this is something that happened this morning in my other session where I was discussing about putting together a charter for infectious diseases community of practice. So maybe that's a good place to start. So extracting some of the themes, some of the common the discussion points that were mentioned today, we can put together a charter for this group to review, maybe a couple of pages. And that could be a good starting point, and forming a community of practice that acts as a broad framework. And under that, we can then come up with, say, work plans, or we can come up with smaller working groups that will work towards tangible outputs, recommendations, guidelines, standards. But I think to start with a community of practice, we can put together a charter of values. And I've completely stolen this idea from my previous work, so it's not original. Just transferring knowledge, that's it. Does that sound like something we can do?
Yeah, that sounds good to me, Priyanka.
So if someone's keen on helping to put together the charter, if someone could just raise their hand, we could make a record of that, and then we can have a smaller meeting before we put together the charter and then distribute it to the wider group. Does anyone want to put their hand up for the charter? Got 3 hands here. Thanks, Kira. Excellent. So we've got few hands, few willing people. We don't want to put anyone on the spot, so I will not take names. But we will get together, put together a first draft of the charter, mainly from the discussion points that were covered today. And then we will circulate it to the wider group for review, and then we can take it from there. Does that sound good? You can see a few heads nodding. Perfect. Thank you so much for your time, everyone. This has been an excellent session. Thank you for your participation, and especially thank you to people who are attending at really weird hours. I can relate. I was at a session at 4 in the morning, and Crystal and Alex were there to support me. So thank you for your knowledge, and thank you for everything that you've contributed to the workshop. Does anyone else have any closing remarks?
Only to say, Nichola, would you be able to export the chat, please, because you're host? Thank you.
Yes.
Perfect.
Thank you, everyone. This has been a really great conversation, and it's, you know, we can't be in person together, but it's been really great to share our discussion remotely today.
Excellent. Thank you so much.
Cool.
Everyone. Thanks, everyone.
We'll be in touch.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys.
Bye.